Chapter 6. Bacteria and Business Replay the Tape. I am inclined to believe that in nearly the same way as two men have sometimes independently hit on the very same invention, so natural selection, working for the good of each being and taking advantage of analogous variations, has sometimes modified in very nearly the same manner two parts in two organic beings which owe but little of their structure in common to inheritance from the same ancestor. Charles Darwin, On the Origin of Species, Chapter 6, Difficulties of the Theory. Charlie and I have many reasons to be thankful for our association with Chuck and C's. The obvious ones are that we've earned exceptional returns and had a good time in the process. Equally important, ownership of C's has taught us much about the evaluation of franchises. We've made significant money in certain common stocks because of the lessons we learned at C's. Warren Buffett, Annual Letter to Shareholders, 1991. Tim Cooper had no idea that cold and windy Saturday morning in a lab at Michigan State University in January 2003 would be one of the most important of his life. Tim started performing his well-rehearsed routine. He had done it dozens of times over the past 3 years, but he knew that he had to be very careful. He was. The experiment had been going for 14 straight years, and he was not going to be the one responsible for any mishap. First, he took a set of 12 new flasks and carefully measured exactly 9.9 milliliters of fluid into each. Next, he went to the incubator and removed the 12 old flasks housing generation number 33,127. He would inoculate the new flasks with 0.1 milliliters of fluid from each of these 12 old flasks. But he needed to check the old flasks first. He picked up 2 of them and saw what he expected. The next 2 flasks also seemed acceptable. But in the third set of 2 flasks, in the flask labeled Era 3, he saw that the fluid had turned opaque instead of being mildly cloudy like in the other old flasks. That shouldn't have happened. The lab had seen similar problems in the past owing to contamination. There was a strict protocol for solving the issue and Tim was well versed in it. Tim replaced the faulty old Era 3 flask and came back on Sunday to check the outcome. Of course, he expected the usual result. But he was in for the same surprise. The new Era 3 flask, too, had turned turbid. Something was very wrong. Or very right. The Astonishing Anoles. Our investment strategy has an unusual feature. We don't invest in individual businesses. It may seem like we do, but we don't. What in the world do we invest in then? Let's do an evolutionary thought experiment to answer the question. Imagine another Earth-like planet that is at a similar distance from its sun-like star. This is not entirely improbable since there are 1,000,000,000,1021 stars in the universe. Would this planet evolve the same life forms as those on Earth? How likely is it to have honeysuckles and hornbills? Philosophers may have pondered this question for millennia, but the first modern scientist to attempt an answer was the late Harvard paleontologist and evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould. In his excellent book Wonderful Life, Gould took the position that evolution was unpredictable. Replay the tape 1,000,000 times and I doubt that anything like Homo sapiens would ever evolve again. If the evolutionary tape were replayed 1,000,000 times, each outcome would depend on 2 opposing forces. On the one hand, the non-random force of natural selection would ensure that organisms develop a small set of foreseeable solutions to the obstacles imposed on them by the environment. On the other, chance mutations and rare environmental events would make any kind of prediction impossible. Which would win? The bad news is that we can't possibly perform the experiment, Gould mused. The good news is that although we can't perform the experiment, nature can and has. Do you want evidence? Let's start with lizards. More than 700 Caribbean islands are home to about 150 species of lizard called Anoles, genus Anoles. All the Caribbean species are the descendants of just 2 species that arrived from the mainland millions of years ago. Dr. Jonathan Lozos, a professor of biology at Washington University, has been studying the Anoles since the late 1980s on the 4 larger Caribbean islands of Cuba, Jamaica, Hispaniola, and Puerto Rico. Professor Lozos discovered that the 150 species across these 4 islands are broadly clustered into 6 groups or ecomorphs: trunk, twig, crown giant, trunk crown, and grassbush. This classification rests on body length, tail length, limb length, toe pad lamellae scales on the feet of the anoles that help them stick to a surface, color, and habitat. For example, the trunk ecomorph lives on tree trunks, has an average body length of about 5 centimeters, has a short tail, and is gray. A very different ecomorph, the grassbush, lives in the grasses and bush, has an average body length of 4 centimeters, has a very long tail, and is brown. The behavioral and physical traits of various Anole ecomorphs have adapted very well to the Anole's unique local environments. Thus, the long tail of the grassbush ecomorph helps the Anole achieve spectacular balance on narrow and unstable surfaces like blades of grass, and its brown color melds with the color of the bush and grasses. The trunk ecomorph is very different because it has a solid tree trunk underneath its feet for most of its life. It does not need a long tail for balance. But it does need its gray color, which can provide camouflage against the gray tree trunk, thereby fooling its predators and prey. The twig Anole has short legs to help it navigate the small twigs on which it lives. Finally, the trunk-ground ecomorph has evolved long legs to run efficiently on tree trunks and the ground. No surprises here, Darwinian natural selection is alive and well on the gorgeous islands of the Caribbean. What is surprising, however, is that the same ecomorphs are seen across the 4 islands. Thus, the trunk ecomorph in Cuba looks and behaves very similarly to the trunk ecomorph in Hispaniola, and the crown giant ecomorph in Puerto Rico is indistinguishable from the one in Jamaica. I know what you were thinking. Are the trunk Anoles the same species that colonized Cuba and Hispaniola? DNA analysis has demonstrated that they aren't. The 6 ecomorph Anoles on the island of Cuba are much more closely related to one another than they are to Anoles on other islands. Thus, the trunk Anoles in Cuba are much more closely related to the twig Anoles in Cuba than to the trunk Anoles in Hispaniola. The Anoles living on tree trunks on the islands of Cuba and Hispaniola are very different species but have developed the same physical and behavioral characteristics on encountering similar environments. This is true for all 6 ecomorphs. When presented with a specific problem, the Caribbean Anoles on different islands have evolved the same solutions, such as tail length, body length, and color. Amazingly, they have done it independently of one another. The Anoles are a textbook example of evolutionary convergence, wherein unrelated organisms in similar environments develop the same body form and adaptations independently. Convergence is ubiquitous. The fascinating example of convergence in Caribbean Anoles is a rule, not an exception, in the natural world. Dolphins are mammals just like us, and sharks are fish. But their fusiform body shapes are pretty similar, and more interestingly, they have the same coloration. Both have a light underbelly and darker back, making them harder to spot from above and below. George McGee, a paleontologist, claims that the reason sharks, dolphins, tuna, and the extinct ichthyosaur look alike is that there is only one way for a fast-swimming animal to evolve. Invertebrates, powered flight evolved in birds, bats, and the now extinct pterosaurs. Their common ancestor, a land-based quadruped, had no wings. Their wings appear to be the same, but they have evolved separately and independently. In all 3, the forearms have been modified into wings, and all take or took to the sky in the same way, by flapping their wings downward to create upward lift and forward movement. Australia punches much above its weight in the sporting world. This nation of only 25 million people won 547 medals in the Summer Olympics before Tokyo 2020, exceeding many nations much more significant in population. For example, its medal tally is 1/5 that of the United States, whose population is 13 times larger. Now is not the time or place for me to comment on India's medal tally. Sport is not the only thing that makes this country, or continent if you prefer, unique. Australia was part of the supercontinent Pangaea and its southern segment Gondwanaland, which started breaking apart about 180 million years ago. As a result, Australia has been a freestanding continent for about 35 million years. The mammals on this massive island have been taking a unique evolutionary path during this time. The Australian mammals are all marsupials who give birth to undeveloped young ones and raise them in an external pouch. Most of the world has placental mammals, like us, who give birth to fully developed infants. Does the dramatic difference in their life histories and development process mean that marsupials look very different from the placentals? Surprisingly not. Compare the images of the Australian marsupials to those of the placentals in Figure 6.1. If we were to place them next to one another, it would not be easy to differentiate a wolf from the now extinct thylacine, the mouse from the mulgara, or the marmot from the wombat. They look similar despite being unrelated genetically because they have solved a similar problem in a similar way in vastly different regions of the world. Now let's take the example of a niche predator that preys mainly on termites. How would you design such an organism? What traits should it possess? I assume you will agree that it should have a long and sticky tongue to trap and eat termites, it should have solid front claws for digging into termite mounds, its head should be small, and it should have a long snout that can enter termite mounds with ease. Congratulations, you have designed the marsupial anteater, called the numbat, as well as the placental anteater. As you may expect, they look surprisingly alike. Through convergence, they have developed a similar appearance and body parts without having a close common ancestor because both needed to solve the problem of how to eat termites. Charles Darwin recognized the power of convergence when he asserted animals belonging to two most distinct lines of descent may readily become adapted to similar conditions and thus assume a close external resemblance. Darwin was right, but not entirely so. Convergence is ubiquitous and not limited just to the external appearance or morphology of animals. It is also widely observed and documented in animal behavior and in plants, fungi, and even bacteria. Let's start with behavior. What do you think these four species, a cobra, a stickleback fish, an octopus, and a spider, share? There is no convergence in body form here, unlike the Caribbean anoles. But a behavior has converged among them that has led to the success of each of their species. The females of the species guard their eggs. One of the best examples of convergent behavior is observed in humans and hold your breath ants. And I have witnessed this convergence with my own eyes. When I was on a family vacation in the stunningly beautiful Peruvian Amazon, I stumbled upon the tiny creatures that had beaten our human ancestors to the discovery of agriculture by many millions of years, the leafcutter ants. I had waited years to witness the miracle, and there it was in its full linear glory. A long single column of thousands of large green leaves appeared to be miraculously moving in perfect synchrony of their own volition on the forest floor. Each large leaf was being carried by a single tiny ant who purposefully disappeared underground to pass on the booty to her specialist sisters. These ants chew the leaves to grow a fungus garden used for food for the entire colony. Not unlike human farmers, these ants produce fertilizers, amino acids, and enzymes to aid the fungal growth, remove contaminants that can hinder the agricultural output, are highly selective in what they grow, and continuously tend to their enormous gardens. And just as agriculture helped us become the dominant species on this planet, leafcutter ants have become the dominant herbivores of the New World. They consume close to 1/6 of all leaves produced in tropical forests. Humans and leafcutter ants have solved their food problems by converging toward a similar solution, crossing time and species boundaries. Let's move on to plants. Most of us have had coffee, tea, and chocolate derived from cacao. The Brazilians among us will be familiar with the drink Guarana antarctica, made from the guarana plant in the Amazon rainforest. All four plants produce the same chemical desired by humans, a purine alkaloid called 1,3,7-trimethylpurine 2,6-dione, in short, caffeine. These four plants may seem to be closely related, but they aren't. The common ancestor of tea and coffee dates back 100 million years. Cacao is more closely related to maple and eucalyptus trees than to tea and coffee. Bizarrely, the ancestor of coffee gave rise to potatoes and tomatoes, but not tea. Plants have many defense mechanisms against predators, and it appears that some have converged toward the same solution, producing caffeine. Many plants rely on birds to pollinate their flowers. So if a plant depends on hummingbirds for pollination, what should it do? Develop red flowers because red is attractive to hummingbirds. Consequently, 18 types of plants that hummingbirds pollinate have evolved bright red flowers. Other plants have developed a different strategy, one that exploits flies and beetles' penchant for laying eggs on smelly decomposing carcasses. 7 types of plants, including the corpse lily and the Zulu giant or carrion flower, have evolved to produce a smell that resembles rotting meat. The odor fools the insects, and while visiting the plants to lay their eggs, they transfer pollen from one flower to another. I could go on and on to fill this book with examples of convergent evolution in the natural world. But scientists now agree that convergence is the rule, not an exception, in nature. This sentiment is best expressed by the most famous advocate of convergence, the Cambridge paleontologist Simon Conway Morris, who has written 2 books on the subject. He has explained convergence by saying, certainly it's not the case that every Earth-like planet will have life, let alone humanoids. But if you want a sophisticated plant, it will look awfully like a flower. If you want to fly, there are only a few ways you can do that. If you want to swim like a shark, there are only a few ways you can do that. If you want to invent warm-bloodedness like birds and mammals, there are only a few ways to do that. Convergence in nature symbolizes a profound fact: there is a pattern to success and failure. What can the Caribbean anole, the crest-tailed marsupial mouse, and caffeine teach us about investing? Convergence in business symbolizes a profound fact: there is a pattern to success and failure. We don't invest in individual businesses. Earlier in the chapter, I made the following assertion about our investment strategy: we don't invest in individual businesses. It may seem like we do, but we don't. So what in the world do we invest in then? We invest in convergent patterns. We seek patterns that repeat. As we saw, replaying the tape of life often yields the same result. We operate on the principle that the business world is no different. There is a big difference between asserting, "I love this business," and "I love this business construct." We are fans of the latter, not the former. We don't care about a business, we are deeply attached to a business template. Not unlike the natural world, which converges toward a small subset of answers to the same questions, we have seen that companies around the globe behave in similar ways when facing a similar environment. Not always, but often enough. We have benefited enormously by asking this simple convergence question up front: have we seen this pattern elsewhere? The cost of ignoring patterns, as usual, is best demonstrated through a painful personal experience. In 1999 or 2000, an investment bank showed us a hot private equity deal. There was a lot of interest from many investors, or so the bank led us to believe. The company processed credit cards and had shown modest growth over the past few years. Unsurprisingly, the investment bank's projections showed dramatic growth starting the following year. Skeptical initially, I met the management team and talked to industry participants and investors in the business. Then, after reviewing India's low credit card penetration rates, I convinced myself that while the management's and the bank's projections were aggressive, they weren't too far off the mark. So we invested in the business at a fancy valuation. I wasn't wrong. I was catastrophically wrong. The company did not meet its projections for more than 5 years. The J-curve growth never arrived. I want to emphasize that this was neither the bank's nor the management's fault. They were doing their job. But unfortunately, I forgot to do mine. A few years after this disaster, when I looked back at the projections, I realized that we would have saved our precious capital if I had applied the principle of convergence by asking a few simple questions. The questions I should have asked but did not were as follows: sure, credit card penetration is low in India, but so is penetration for every consumer product. What other consumer products in India have seen these growth rates over the long term? Do you have examples of other countries where we have seen such rapid credit card growth? If so, was their stage of development similar to India's today? I should have demanded a convergent template, but I didn't. Let's see what happens when we do. We invested in InfoEdge in late 2013. It runs India's leading job site, Naukri.com, and is led by Sanjeev Bikhchandani and Hitesh Oberoi, two of the most well-regarded entrepreneurs in India. We did not invest in Naukri because of Sanjeev and Hitesh, but because of the convergent patterns Naukri represents. Naukri allows job-seeking candidates to post their resumes for free and charges companies a subscription fee to access these and list job vacancies. When we invested in 2013, Naukri had a dominant 65% traffic share and was 4 times larger than the second player, Monster India. Given Naukri's dominance, if you are a job seeker in India, you would almost certainly post your resume there. If you are a company trying to hire, you are almost compelled to subscribe to Naukri because it has the most extensive and diverse pool of candidates. It is emblematic of the classic network effect. Naukri is number one because it is number one. Our confidence in InfoEdge was high because it represents not one but 2 convergent patterns. First, the erstwhile Yellow Pages business. Many of you have probably never heard of this life-saving invention, but they were my lifeline until the early 1990s. Yellow Pages were a fixture in every home, just like a television or a refrigerator in the era of rotary landline phones before the age of the internet and mobile phones. Yellow Pages were ungainly, thick telephone directories usually printed on yellow paper that listed local businesses and their goods or services on offer. Yellow Pages could give you a list of tens, even hundreds of options, whether you were looking for a language teacher, a plumber, a wedding planner, a car dealer, or a recording studio. The directory was distributed free to the consumers, and businesses paid a fee to be listed. As a result, the largest Yellow Pages business in any city or region was usually highly profitable because of the virtual monopoly enjoyed by their network effect. Consumers went to them because they listed the largest number of businesses, and businesses subscribed to them because they attracted the largest number of consumers. They were highly defensible businesses, and for the leading companies, the network effect ensured high profits over long periods. It was not unusual for leading Yellow Pages businesses to earn a profit margin in excess of 40%. While Naukri operates in a different era in a different medium, our view was that it converged with many of the virtuous traits of a leading Yellow Pages business. The second convergent pattern we noted was the performance of the leading internet job boards in other countries. This pattern was even more powerful than that of Yellow Pages. We found at least 7 other job boards globally with obscenely high operating margins, more than 30 to 40%, and infinite ROCE, just like Naukri, for example, Seek in Australia, Dice, and Career Builder in the United States. 51 Job in China, Ian in Japan, 104 Corp in Taiwan, and JobStreet in Singapore and Malaysia. These dominant franchises became more dominant each year. Their margin and return profile kept improving. They were all cash machines. The number 2 in any of these markets showed no signs of catching up, and LinkedIn and offline competitors had no impact on them. In other words, they were indistinguishable from Naukri. When we first encountered a 49% operating margin and infinite ROCE for Naukri, we were skeptical. Who earns that kind of money? But after studying the Yellow Pages and companies in other markets, we concluded that this was no fluke. In 2021, Naukri's operating margin was 55%. We invested in Naukri not just because Sanjeev and Hitesh are impressive folks, which they are, or because Naukri makes gobs of money, which it does, or because it has annihilated the competition, which it has. Instead, we invested in Naukri because the convergent models of Yellow Pages and global job board businesses gave us the confidence to believe that the Naukri template is tough to beat. Make that almost impossible to beat. I will state 2 counterfactuals to highlight the importance of this method of investing. First, what if Sanjeev and Hitesh, impressive as they are, were operating the number 2 or 3 job board in India? We would not have touched the business. Winner takes all in the classifieds business, and we would never have bet against that pattern. Second, what if Sanjeev and Hitesh had come to us in the early days of the internet when there was no proof of concept for this business model? Again, we would have walked away because the answer to the question, where else has this worked, would have been no idea. Nevertheless, some venture capitalists did fund Naukri in its early days. Kudos to them. They recognized the genius of Sanjeev and Hitesh and deserved their mouth-watering returns. We detest the phrases "this time it's different" and "my gut tells me this will work." We need to see the evidence that our investment thesis has worked elsewhere. If it hasn't, we are unlikely to touch it. We are the antithesis of the venture capital community, which earns its living by betting on untested and unproven businesses. I am in awe of successful venture capital firms, but my admiration for them will never translate into a desire to emulate them. Kahneman's outside view and convergence. I have learned to invest by investing and by observing other investors. I wish I could have learned from the learned finance and economics academics. Have you tried reading a finance journal or research article on economics or finance? I have, and I must admit I can't understand most of them. They are inundated with Greek symbols, complicated mathematical equations, and esoteric arguments. They leave me baffled as to their utility for actual practitioners like me. But occasionally one of the intellectuals will take my breath away. Daniel Kahneman is one such individual. His masterpiece Thinking, Fast and Slow should be compulsory reading for all Investing 101 classes. If you are already an investor, there's no more valuable chapter to read and reread than Chapter 23, The Outside View. Here, Kahneman describes his experience of leading a team in Israel, designing a curriculum and writing a textbook for high school students on judgment and decision-making. After a year, the team had made reasonable progress. They had prepared a detailed outline of the syllabus, written a couple chapters, and conducted some classroom lessons. One day, Kahneman asked his colleagues to write down an estimate of the time it would take the team to submit a finished textbook draft to the Ministry of Education. Everyone on the team, including Kahneman's colleague Seymour Fox, an expert in curriculum development, estimated that it would take them about 2 years. Kahneman then asked Fox, who had witnessed many other teams develop similar textbooks and curricula over the years, how long it usually takes teams to finish their textbook projects. Fox's answer stunned Kahneman. Seemingly embarrassed, Fox admitted that 40% of such teams never finished the task, and those who did took anywhere from 7 to 10 years. The actual time it took Kahneman's team? 8 years. A far cry from the 2 years they had estimated. Kahneman labels the team's initial estimate of 2 years the inside view. It was based on the team members' specific circumstances, their confidence in their abilities, and extrapolation based on recent goals achieved and a hazy idea of the future. And it was wrong by a wide margin. Kahneman calls the 40% failure estimate of similar projects and the completion time of 7 to 10 years the outside view. As he describes, his questioning of Fox revealed two great insights. First, although Fox was aware of the outside view, he did not even consider it while initially writing down his estimate. And second, although the other team members, including Kahneman, did not have access to the information Fox did, none even attempted to understand the outside view when the project began. But applying convergent thinking or an outside view is neither natural nor easy. As Kahneman himself states succinctly, pallid statistical information is routinely discarded when it is incompatible with one's personal impression of a case. In the competition with the inside view, the outside view does not stand a chance. The outside view does not have a chance in the investment community because, ironically, fund managers and analysts are savvy. Given a choice between applying their intellectual horsepower to a single business by making a 10-year projection of profits or stepping back and asking if any of it even makes sense, brilliant folks often choose the former. As I was transitioning from consulting in my early investing days, I was the biggest believer in the myth that more work produces better answers for investors. It doesn't. Let me illustrate the power of Kahneman's outside view by outlining two ways of analyzing a potential investment in an airline. Imagine that I have just flown to Singapore from New York aboard the uber-comfortable A380 in January 2019. I have thoroughly enjoyed the legendary Singapore Airlines service. After I land, I pick up a financial newspaper and read an interesting article on the enormous potential for airlines in Asia, particularly in India and China. This article also informs me that the famous Tata Group in India launched not one but two airlines a few years ago. The journalist gushes about the limitless growth possibilities on the continent. Having just had a great flying experience and feeling excited about the potential of the fast-growing Asian airline market, I decide to start some serious work on the subject to evaluate an investment in an Asian airline. If you are not from the finance industry, please do not treat this as a frivolous example. Believe it or not, this is how fund managers sometimes get interested in companies. At first glance, there is a lot to like about the airline industry. But, to a fund manager's ears, I can describe it in two words that sound better than Beethoven's symphony: large and growing. Unless you live in a monastery in a remote corner of the world, your life in the modern world, directly or indirectly, is touched by the airline industry. And the industry is beginning to impact Africa and Asia. The phenomenal growth of Dubai and Singapore as airline hubs during the last decade is testimony to the region's potential. At this stage, I have two options. 1. Perform a detailed analysis of one Asian airline, or 2. Focus on understanding the outside view of the airline industry. If I choose option 1, which incidentally many fund managers choose, I will waste my time doing the following time-consuming and futile tasks. My team and I will interview the CEO and CFO at a fancy restaurant. Then we will visit their corporate offices where the senior management team will wax eloquent on the culture and systems of their unique airline. Finally, we will read tens of analyst reports, most of which will be favorable. Do you seriously expect an airline analyst to denigrate their industry? And we will build a fancy Excel spreadsheet with multi-year forecasts of fuel prices, passenger miles, average ticket prices, load factors, gross margins, capital expenditures, inventory levels, lease costs, personnel expenses, marketing costs, airport charges, freight revenues, and heaven knows what else. The result? After many weeks or months of meetings and late nights, we will either buy or choose a price at which we plan to purchase the company's shares if we think the price is too high. Let's see what we would do if we were to choose option 2 instead. We want to analyze the industry in greater depth, and so we start with an extensive study conducted by MIT on the U.S. airline industry from 2000 to 2013. The conclusions of this study are in an 81-page document available for free on the internet. The results are humbling. Surprisingly, despite being a mature market, the U.S. industry grew during this period. The revenue of passenger miles grew about 20% from $709 million to $848 million. However, on total revenue of about $1.4 trillion during this period, the airlines made a cumulative loss of $44 billion. Thus, on an annual revenue of close to $100 billion, the airline industry lost about $3 billion every year from 2000 to 2013. But these averages hide an even sorrier story. During 8 of these 14 years, or almost 60% of the time, the airlines made no money. That is, they declared financial losses or only a meager profit. And in the 6 years they did manage to eke out profits, their total net profit was only about $40 billion. However, the real tragedy is that during just 2 bad years, 2005 and 2008, the industry suffered losses of $54 billion, or $14 billion more than the cumulative profits of $40 billion during the entire period. It is generally assumed that the tragedy of September 11, 2001 was terrible for the airline industry, which is true. U.S. airlines suffered losses of about $19 billion in 2001 and 2002. But in 2005, 4 years after the tragedy and 3 years before the financial meltdown of 2008, the industry declared a total net loss of $28 billion, far exceeding the losses resulting from September 11. The remarkable consistency with which airlines lose money is not a problem unique to the United States. A report from the International Air Transport Association shows that from 2000 to 2014, the industry had not earned its cost of capital for 15 years in a row. Not even in a single year. You must now be thinking what I am thinking. The industry may be destructive overall, but what about the top airlines? Would they not be much better than the industry? Let's look at the return profiles of the top 10 airlines by revenue in the world according to Aviation Week: Lufthansa, All Nippon, Southwest, Qantas, Air China, American, Singapore, Turk Hava, Aeroflot, and Ryanair. Using Morningstar, I calculated their return on equity (ROE) and return on assets (ROA) for 10 years from 2004 to 2013, and the results are terrible. The median ROE of these airlines over 10 years was 6.8% and the median ROA was 2.5%. Scale does not guarantee success in this demanding industry. To sum it up, it's as bad as it gets. After studying the historical patterns in the airline industry, we can conclude the following with a high degree of confidence. 1. U.S. airlines do not make money. 2. The global airline industry does not make money. 3. The top 10 airlines in the world do not make money. The detailed and unfortunate outside view of the industry is quite troubling. Airlines are great for consumers, not for investors. This pessimistic view advises us to stay away from the airline industry. Instead, we should choose to invest our excess cash in a bank deposit rather than buying a single airline share. I am sure many of you are now asking the obvious question. Can one make a decision about investing in an Asian airline based on learnings from US and global airlines? If we can conclude that Asia is not dissimilar to the United States, maybe we can get comfortable with the fact that the fate of Asian airlines will be no different from their US counterparts. At first glance, the industry may appear to be quite different in Asia owing to ownership and international routes. First, most airlines in Asia, including Singapore Airlines, are owned by the government, unlike in the United States, where airlines are under private ownership. Second, most of the heavy traffic routes in Asia are between international destinations, not domestic ones. There are no domestic flights in Singapore or Dubai. But if we dig a bit deeper into the competitive dynamics, we may conclude that Asia is no different from the United States. In the pre-pandemic days, Expedia showed that if you wanted to fly from Singapore to New York, you could choose from among 22 airlines. Competition is no less severe just because the flights are international as opposed to domestic. The airline rivalry in Asia may be more intense than in the United States owing to the ownership structure. Since governments care much less about economics than private investors, they may not be perturbed by continued financial losses. Moreover, most countries seem to treat their airline as a national symbol, so shutting down a national airline, as prudent as it may be for the exchequer, is unheard of in Asia. As a result, in my view, invoking convergence to understand the Asian airline industry is a legitimate investment approach. In this case, applying the outside view to investing yielded us two significant benefits. First, we avoided investing in a company and in an industry in which the odds of making money are very slim indeed. I am not suggesting that it is impossible to make money by investing in airlines if you bought an airline stock at a low enough price. No, I can't define what is low enough and then we're lucky enough to sell it at some profit. Good for you. But I will find a greater fool for my crappy asset is another way to say speculating, not investing. It's not for us. The second benefit was the time, money, and effort saved. Instead of conducting lengthy and unproductive management meetings, schmoozing the investor relations person, paying fat fees to consultants, and spending weeks to construct a multi-megabyte Excel spreadsheet, we spent a few hours on the internet, downloaded a few reports, and made our decision within a few minutes with enough time left to go home early to our families. Some practical ways of applying the principle of convergence. This discussion on airlines should not lead anyone to believe that all will be well just by applying the principle of convergence or the outside view to a specific investment situation. Convergence is not a panacea, nor is it a substitute for thoughtful analysis and synthesis. But when applied wisely, it can be a powerful investment tool. I don't know about the rest of the world, but in India, a married person inherits their spouse's family, whether they like it or not. The likelihood of getting along with your spouse over the long term is relatively low if you don't like your spouse's first, second, and occasionally even third cousins. For the record, my in-laws are the best. Investing in companies is no different. Buying into a business means also buying into the industry of that business. For example, while I may think I am investing in a company that makes and sells sanitary ware, I am inheriting all the good and the bad of the sanitary ware industry. No company is an island. We can never ignore the kinds of businesses that surround it. One of our principles of convergence investing is that if the industry allows its companies to make money consistently, we love it. If not, we better have a perfect reason for spending even 1 minute analyzing a business like an airline. Life is too short. There are 3 potential answers to the question of an industry's attractiveness and profitability. First is that the companies in the industry struggle to keep their heads above water, just as we saw in the case of airlines. Industries like telecom towers, garment manufacturing, and commodity chemicals are notorious value destroyers. Most companies in these industries barely earn their cost of capital. As I have said repeatedly, one of the immensely underappreciated values of any strategy, including an investment strategy, is what it advises us not to do. The principle of convergence demands that I avoid investing in these industries. If most companies in the industry can't hack it, why should I believe that this company is unique? The second conclusion could be that the industry is uniformly attractive for its participants. For example, companies like Accenture, Cognizant, Infosys, and TCS in the information technology IT outsourcing industry earn more than 40 to 50% ROCE and have been doing so for decades. If you accept convergence investing as we do, you should love assessing companies in the IT industry. For example, when we evaluated an investment in Mindtree, India's leading mid-tier IT services business, we knew that the company had been very profitable for many years. But how could we be sure that it would continue to be successful? By witnessing the convergent outcomes of other businesses in the industry, all of which had been able to scale their revenues over many decades without sacrificing profitability. In other words, it happened there, so all else being equal, there was a high probability that it could happen here. My optimistic view does not mean that I will invest in any company in the IT services industry. Instead, my actual investment will depend on factors like valuation, financial risk, management track record, capital allocation, customer concentration, market share, and so on. But the companies in this industry would be right on top of my radar as Mindtree was. You may think these industries that churn money spinners would be rare, at least that is what microeconomic theory would espouse. But they are not. Our portfolio is full of companies in desirable industries: enzymes, paints, cookers, business process outsourcing, bearings, compressors, consumer electricals, sanitary ware, and steam turbines, to name just a few. Last, convergence can inform us that only some companies make money in specific industries, whereas most others don't. For example, walking along Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, I am dazzled by the brilliance and splendor of fashion stores. But fashion is a brutal place to be in. Very few companies grow revenues and profits steadily. Most are shooting stars that shine for a few moments and then disappear into oblivion. The same is true for retailers and restaurants. These are the trickiest companies for us to assess. Should we bet on a single business in an unattractive industry, or should we just walk away? If we evaluate a company in these industries, which we rarely do, we are exceptionally demanding. We will not invest in anyone but the undisputed leader. We use the principle of convergence across many other areas of business apart from assessing industry attractiveness. We use it much more often to figure out what not to do. I want to take you back to Chapter 1, which focused exclusively on the importance of avoiding significant risks. I contended that avoiding risky investments is more important and more difficult for most investors than making good investments. As a quick reminder, I highlighted 6 types of businesses we avoid at all costs. 1. Those owned and run by crooks. 2. Turnaround situations. 3. Those with high levels of debt. 4. M&A junkies. 5. Those in fast-changing industries. 6. Those with unaligned owners. How did I arrive at this list? Through a combination of reliving bad experiences 1, 2, and 5, doing some factual data analysis 4, 5, and 6, watching others stumble 2, 3, and 6, and learning from owners of portfolio companies 4 and 5. The common thread through all of these was the hunger for detecting patterns and seeking a convergence of outcomes. Investors can detect or manufacture a vast range of patterns across businesses. This is not the place to discuss all of them. Instead, this chapter intends to make the simple claim that one of the most important questions an investor can ask is, where else has this worked? Before moving on, let me discuss one more aspect of convergence investing that I think has been critical to our success. We are price sensitive. The median trailing price to earnings (PE) ratio for our portfolio at the time of our investment is less than 15 when the Indian market has been about 19 to 20. We have rarely ever paid more than 20 times trailing PE. Most importantly, we have never said this is such a great business that even 30 PE is justified. As I have made clear in previous chapters, we have no interest in investing in low-quality or mediocre businesses at any price. Our portfolio companies are truly stellar based on verifiable empirical data on historical financials, industry market share, balance sheet quality, and customer satisfaction. Moreover, the markets are generally quite efficient. Businesses like these are rarely available at a throwaway price. Since we have chosen to invest exclusively in world-class businesses, we have two options. 1. Invest at a high valuation hoping that the price will rise further, or 2. Stay inactive for long periods until we get the price we want. We have always chosen option 2. Why? Convergence. Valuation matters for equity returns over the long run across years, countries, and the size of companies. The lower the valuation, the higher the prospective long-term returns. It has worked everywhere over very long periods, so who are we to defy it? There is a lot of empirical research on equity valuation and returns. The article on this topic that I like best is Value and Growth Investing, Review and Update by Louis K.C. Chan and Joseph Lakonishok. I love this article for two reasons. First, it is a meta-research article that summarizes the conclusions of many other researchers over many years across several countries. Second, while Chan and Lakonishok are both academics from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, Lakonishok is also the CEO and Chief Investment Officer of a $100 billion fund called LSV Asset Management. It's always good to hear from people whose research conclusions matter to their bank balance. The article has many tables with reams of data, and if you don't have much time, I suggest focusing on Table 2. It shows returns over 20 years from 1975 to 1995. Across 13 countries for value stocks, those with low valuation, and glamour stocks, those with high valuation across 4 valuation measures. The results are stark. The value portfolio beats the glamour portfolio across almost all countries. And the outperformance is not trivial. It ranges from 1.5 percentage points for Switzerland to 6.7 percentage points for the United States, based on PE ratio as the valuation measure. The first paragraph of their conclusion is worth repeating in full. A large body of empirical research indicates that value stocks, on average, earn higher returns than growth stocks. The reward to value investing is more pronounced for small-cap stocks, but it is also present in large-cap stocks. The value premium exists also in equity markets outside the United States. Why should we risk investing at high valuations when we know that the result will be poor on average? Some of you may detect a paradox here. Unlike LSV Asset Management, which relies on sophisticated quantitative analysis, we do in-depth qualitative research on industries and businesses. As a result, we know a lot about our portfolio companies and their industries. Given that we have an informed view of them, should we not be willing to pay up when the opportunity arises? No. Why? Because I have more respect for the convergence theme with respect to valuation and potential returns than my intellect. I wish I were more intelligent, but I am not. We now arrive at an obvious question. Under what situations should we not apply the principle of convergence? Not as straightforward as it sounds. Someone wise, reputed to be Einstein, but there is no agreement, once remarked, everything should be made as simple as possible but not simpler. Life is complicated, and so is investing. The principle of convergence may seem intelligible, I hope, and its implementation a cinch. Sorry to disappoint you, but this seemingly easy-to-use tool generates its own set of thorny issues. Give me a conclusion you desire, and I am reasonably confident that I would rationalize it based on the principle of convergence. A couple of anecdotes may masquerade as a pattern. One pattern can be ignored in favor of another, or one can simply resort to telling a story that seems to weave in an outside view where there is none. If you are an investor or choose to be one, you will need to learn your lessons the hard way. However, here are some pointers based on my experience. The probability of convergent evolution is higher in living organisms if they share similarities in genetics, development, and ecology. Unsurprisingly, the greater the similarity of conditions in businesses, the greater is the benefit of using the principle of convergence in investing. Conditions here could mean industry structure, geography, competitive dynamics, stage of business, the similarity of business models, and much more. For example, we saw that the Caribbean Anoles were endowed with the same physical attributes when conditions were similar across the islands. Therefore, businesses should operate under the same principle. Let me take the example of 3 types of businesses to explain the complications of applying the principle of convergence. Assume that I am evaluating an investment in a company that builds residential properties in Germany. To incorporate an outside view, I would start with developing an understanding of the dynamics of the German residential property market, the industry participants, track record of growth and profitability, extent of consolidation, and anything else that would get me smart on the overall German residential market. I would prefer not to draw parallels with Germany's commercial or retail real estate market because the industry structure and types of players are usually different across these segments. Should I study the French, Spanish, or Brazilian residential real estate market? It depends whether these other markets have a similar industry structure to that of Germany. Example, is the industry fragmented or consolidated? Or whether the regulations are primarily comparable. Example, if a government subsidizes mortgage payments for its citizens, it will dramatically affect consumer behavior. Intuitively, given the cultural and historical affinity of the French and Spanish residential markets, I would be more inclined to draw lessons from those markets and not Brazil's. But maybe someone can find a way to draw lessons even from Brazil. What about the U.S. residential real estate market? I am not sure. I would need to do some work to understand if there are any parallels between Germany and the United States. Take the case of a German company manufacturing industrial robots. These robots are supplied to manufacturing businesses across the world. Since this is a global business, I would not worry too much about the German angle here. Instead, I would research enterprises supplying the same or similar equipment worldwide, whether based in China, Italy, or Singapore, to understand their growth, profitability, and trends in market share. I would also go one level higher to analyze the performance of global businesses that supply sophisticated industrial machinery. I may not assign as much weight to the second analysis, but I would study it to discern any apparent trends if available. Some of you may argue that I was too quick to dismiss the German engineering businesses in general. Maybe something about German engineering strength can serve as a template for an industrial robot business. I am skeptical, but perhaps you are right. So go ahead and do the work. Third, take the case of a German hospital business. Should we use convergent investing by assessing the economics and industry structure of hospitals in the United Kingdom, Italy, and the Netherlands? Healthcare in most markets is heavily regulated, and this may significantly impact the economics of a hospital. It would be too cumbersome to assess the impact of local laws on the hospitals in each country. Instead, we could use a shortcut to see if the overall hospital economics or those of the top 5 to 10 hospitals, if industry data are unavailable, are comparable across countries. Since hospitals are a services business, can we use the information from other German services sectors, say, hotels, to refine our assessment? Think about it. One situation in which we never apply convergence is when the industry is new or fast-changing. Convergent evolution is more evident in plants and insects since they have been around on Earth longer than birds and mammals. It takes time for convergence to emerge. This fact is equally applicable to the world of business. We have noticed greater convergence in older industries, example, paint, garments, engines, turbines, cars, and less in newer ones, example, virtual reality, robotics, electric vehicles, biotechnology. Industries converge towards similar fates after the companies have had enough time to plan and execute their strategies, after winners and losers have been, essentially, decided, and when the pace of change has declined. Thus, if we are exploring an investment in a paint company in Germany, it would be helpful to study the paint industry in the Western world. But if we were in the year 2000 drawing parallels from the U.S. e-commerce industry for an investment in a Chinese e-retailer may have been taking things a bit too far. As you can see, convergence investing is not an objective, bias-free, mathematical endeavor that always yields the same answer. As a result, you may have a different view of one or more of my conclusions. And therein lies all the fun and frustration of investing. This brings us back to Tim Cooper and the mysteriously turbid Era 3 flask. Lessons from Lenski. On February 24, 1988, Professor Richard Lenski seeded 12 sterile flasks containing 10 milliliters of glucose solution with the common bacterium Escherichia coli, commonly called E. coli. Lenski had started an experiment that continues today and has yielded hundreds of research articles, dozens of doctorates, and global acclaim. He started an experiment on long-term evolution like the one conducted on silver foxes by Ludmila Trut and Dmitry Belayev, but with two key differences. First, he wanted to use microscopic organisms that have a generation time of only 20 minutes, thereby allowing tens of thousands of generations to evolve over a human lifetime. Second, unlike the artificial selection experiments on foxes or dogs or wheat, in which the experimenter chooses who or what reproduces, Lenski wanted the experimental environment to choose. When the experiment started, all 12 flasks had genetically the same E. coli since all cells came from the same mother cell. Each flask contained hundreds of millions of bacteria, so there was ample opportunity for mutations to emerge. An essential experimental twist was that food was in limited supply. Every day, the E. coli population increased for about 6 hours until the glucose was exhausted. At this point, the bacteria would stop dividing and wait. The next day, a lab member, someone like Tim Cooper, would take 0.1 milliliters out of each flask, 1% of the flask's content, and inoculate a new flask containing 9.9 milliliters of fresh glucose solution. A new cycle would then begin until the next day, when the same procedure would be repeated. And the next day. Week after week, month after month, year after year. Lenski was replaying Gould's proverbial tape of life simultaneously in 12 flasks. He wasn't selecting the bacteria and he wasn't varying the medium. Instead, he was letting life run its course in parallel over thousands of generations. What he found was remarkable. In 2011, after 50,000 generations of evolution, he said, "To my surprise, evolution was pretty repeatable. Although the lineages certainly diverged in many details, I was struck by the parallel trajectories of their evolution with similar changes in so many phenotypic traits and even gene sequences we examined." It wasn't that the bacteria had not evolved. On the contrary, they had evolved a lot. The E. coli in different flasks adapted differently to the starvation diet by either growing faster or becoming more numerous than earlier generations. But the general trend was unmistakable. On average, the population grew 70% faster than their founding ancestors. In addition, the researchers found another example of convergent evolution. All 12 populations of bacteria had lost the ability to synthesize a sugar called D-ribose because all had undergone the same set of genetic changes. Unlike Gould's prediction, the replaying of the tape of life was yielding the same result. Until one day, 15 years after the start of the experiment, Tim Cooper found that it didn't. The reason the Era 3 flask had turned opaque was that, unlike the other flasks, it had experienced a population explosion. The Era 3 population was 10 times the size of the populations in the other flasks. How could this have happened when all flasks had only a limited amount of glucose? The Era 3 bacteria had developed the ability to feed on some other ingredient in the solution. The only other candidate was a molecule called citrate present in all glucose solutions from day one. However, at the time of the beginning of the experiment, E. coli was explicitly known not to synthesize citrate in the presence of oxygen. Therefore, this inability was used to identify whether a type of bacteria was E. coli or not. The 33,127th generation of Lenski's bacteria had deviated drastically from the clean and simple story of inevitable convergence. It was as big a case of divergence as biology had ever seen experimentally. Lenski's lab later found that the ability of the Era 3 bacteria to digest citrate resulted from a series of mutations after about 20,000 generations. Unfortunately, each mutation was rare, so no bacteria in any of the other flasks have developed this ability. It is worth paying attention to the two critical lessons from Lenski's long-term experiment. 1. Convergence is the dominant pattern in the natural world. 2. On rare occasions, it isn't. We can replace just one word to derive the same two critical lessons for us investors. 1. Convergence is the dominant pattern in the business world. 2. On rare occasions, it isn't. I have been singing the praises of convergence as a powerful investing tool, which it is. Of course, there are only a few ways for businesses to succeed. As investors, identifying a convergent pattern of success or failure has helped us make what we think are some excellent investments and avoid many bad ones. But I have also reached a painful realization that patterns can break and a successful era 3 type mutant can arise occasionally. Unfortunately, we would miss an opportunity to invest in it. If one replays the tape of business history across periods and countries, the overwhelming convergent pattern would be that business focus leads to success. Most of our portfolio comprises businesses with only one product or service or a small set of related products and services. We refuse to invest in diversified companies or conglomerates. We also express disappointment when any of our management teams try to deviate from their course. If I were an investor in the United States, I would have missed Amazon by adhering to this investment philosophy. Amazon has a market value of about $1 trillion. This business started as an electronic book retailer and diversified into an ever-growing list of offerings, many of which have almost nothing to do with one another. You can watch a movie on Prime Video after reading its review in a magazine bought on Kindle. You can be attired in comfortable Amazon essentials when you order milk and eggs through Amazon Fresh Delivery by talking to Alexa. Amazon Logistics will deliver your groceries and announce their arrival at your doorstep via Ring. While playing Amazon Music, you can earn some money by completing a Mechanical Turk survey hosted on Amazon Web Services. And you can be a citizen of any of the 58 countries globally with Amazon's presence. If Era 3 had a brain, it would have been intensely jealous of Jeff Bezos, who seems to have broken every business rule to outmutate the ultimate mutant. In 2017, Warren Buffett admitted on CNBC's Squawk Box that he should have invested in Amazon. I have no such qualms. I know that I would have missed Amazon in the past, and I will miss an Amazon-like business in the future. So be it. The only saving grace of this failure? I doubt I will see another Bezos in my lifetime. When I advocate convergence investing, I admit my incompetence. I am effectively saying I don't know how to assess this particular business. Maybe this is why the approach of taking the outside or convergent view while being straightforward is not followed as widely as it should be. Yet, since 2007, we have kept doing what we love, asking questions that lead us to companies' patterns of success and failure. In our profession, getting the correct answer is easy. But, unfortunately, asking the right question is not. Chapter Summary. Evolutionary theory has taught me that an important element of reimagining investing is internalizing the recurring patterns of success and failure in the business world. 1. Convergence, unrelated organisms developing the same solutions to similar problems, is ubiquitous in nature. It is seen across animals, plants, fungi, and even bacteria. In nature, every problem seems to have only a small set of solutions. 2. For example, Australia's flora and fauna has been evolving independently of those of the rest of the world for more than 35 million years when Australia became a separate continent, but for every Australian marsupial, there seems to be a placental counterpart. 3. The business world, too, is convergent. There are definitive patterns to the success and failure of companies. We exploit this property of the corporate world to select outstanding businesses and reject lousy ones by asking a simple question: where else have we seen this? 4. We are investors not in individual businesses but in proven and successful templates of businesses. 5. We are big fans of Daniel Kahneman's outside view, which is conceptually similar to convergence and compels us to seek similar patterns elsewhere before making an investment decision. 6. However, applying the principle of convergence is tricky because we humans can see patterns where none exist. We can also miss out on one-off opportunities like Amazon that seem to defy the convergent notion that focus is the key to success.